Okay, hello and welcome. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to our third GMRG webinar. Again, a webinar with a focus on the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's webinar title is Operational Restart and Recovery for the Automotive Supply Chain. Our webinar today, as the title says, will focus on restart readiness after the pandemic in the automotive industry. Our panelists today represent Wayne State University and the Automotive Industry Action Group, AIAG. Of course, it's great to welcome experts that are so closely related to the automotive hotspot in the United States from Michigan. So that's really a pleasure. My name is Robert Wittmer, Assistant Professor of Supply Chain Management at Arizona State University, and I will guide you through our webinar today. Before I introduce our panelists today and our today's webinar, I would like to provide some background information about the Global Manufacturing Research Group. It will just take a few minutes, and then we will start with our panel introduction as well as with our webinar. So I want to just provide some background information about GMRG, then its vision statement as well as its activities. And then also I just want to provide some information how you can join and participate in GMRG's activities. Now, GMRG, the Global Manufacturing Research Group, was founded in 1980 by Clay Weibark at the University of North Carolina and by Buhoro at Sogang University in South Korea. Now, since then, the organization grew consistently, but the vision for sure remained the same. Now, it's clear that the vision was and is to foster collaboration between industry experts and researchers by sharing ideas, concepts, and research findings with research colleagues and manufacturing professionals. Now, the main goal, and I emphasize it here in bold and italics, is to strengthen the linkage between research and practice. Now, how do we translate this vision into action? Now, GMRG's key objective is to study, understand, and improve manufacturing supply chains. And that, of course, also includes managing disruptions such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what are some of the key characteristics of GMRG? Well, it's a multinational community of researchers with a truly global focus. It's really important to mention that this organization is run by volunteers now for over 40 years. It's run by researchers, doctoral students, academics with a lot of practical industry experience. Now, the application of state-of-the-art research method is really key to create relevant and rigorous knowledge to practitioners. That's what we are strongly focused on. And the other, sometimes it's a weakness in academia, another focus is to share results with practitioners and researchers, something we have recently focused on, and this webinar is also one initiative to strengthen this last objective. Now, very briefly about some of the GMRG activities. Now, at the heart of the organization is really the global survey on manufacturing practices. This survey is conducted approximately every 5 years, and the GMRG surveys focus on understanding manufacturing practices and how manufacturing practices are linked to topics such as sustainability, risk management, information management, organizational culture, and other topics. Now, currently we're working on the 6th round of the GMRG survey, as well as working on many other collaborative projects. Another key pillar of the organization is the annual GMRG conference. It was hosted in the last years in Hungary, Australia, US, Canada. This year it was planned to be hosted in China, then Brazil, but of course, due to the corona pandemic, it moved to a virtual space as so many other conferences. But nevertheless, we remain global. And then the last point, in the last 40 years, over 150 collaborative projects have been completed either between practitioners and academics or among academics. Now, if you are interested in learning more about GMRG, or if you want to participate as a company or as a researcher in GMRG, please contact us. One easy way is to write an email to gmrggroup@gmail.com, or you can go on LinkedIn and find us on LinkedIn there, also with more recent information. And then just before I move here to our panel, just one other quick question, and I hope you can see here my screen. We want to learn what other topics are of interest. What topics in manufacturing and operations management would you like to discuss in future GMRG webinars? Now, please share your thoughts. You can do it in a very easy way now or after the webinar. Simply go to menti.com and use the code 2452628, again, menti.com, and the code is 2452628. I will come back to this slide later. Okay, so with this, again, welcome back to our webinar. Now, we have this webinar structured in basically two main parts. In the next approximately 40 minutes, we have panel presentations and just brief discussions, and we focus on four main topics. First, we learn about the research that was conducted in the area of restart readiness in the automotive industry. We learn about some of the challenges faced by companies. After that, we move into the discussion of strategies and innovations to mitigate some of the risk. And then lastly, we will have a brief outlook into what will happen in the next months and years. After that, we have an open discussion. We have a QA session where we will discuss your questions. So if you are now in the audience and you have questions during the four panel presentations, please share your question in the Zoom Q&A function. Again, use the Zoom Q&A function to share your question. We will collect your question and then we will address as many questions as possible. If we cannot answer your question now, we will do it later by email. Okay, so that's it regarding our organization. And now I finally come to our panelist introduction. So it's really a pleasure to introduce our panelists today. First, Laurie Sisk. She is a supply chain and purchasing lecturer at Wayne State University, for over 5 years, but she has more than 28 years of experience in purchasing and supply management as practitioner and a consultant. She worked for many companies, General Motors, Delphi, Ernst & Young, Hewlett-Packard, just to name a few. Welcome, Laurie. Next, Lang Ware. He is the director of the Automotive Industry Action Group's Commercial Services, AIAG, and he has a lot of automotive-related experience, including sales, marketing, business development, export and global distribution, cybersecurity. Now, Lang worked for more than 30 years at Ford Motor Companies. After that, he started his own consultancy before joining AIAG. Welcome, Lang. Next, we have Dr. Ting-Ting Yang. She is an associate professor at Wayne State University. Her research interests are in innovation and supply chain management, and basically centered around one question. How can firms better innovate by managing their supply networks and as well as understanding their suppliers' extended networks? And finally, Dr. Hakan Yildiz. He is also an associate professor of supply chain management at Wayne State University. He has a PhD in operations research from Carnegie Mellon. He has written several papers in the areas of supply chain risk management, analytics, and logistics optimization. And with this, welcome to our webinar today. Before I hand over to Laurie, I want to express a special thank to all the participating organizations, GMRG and ASU, for making this webinar happen, as well as AIAG, Wayne State University, and QAD Manufacturing Consulting for sharing their research insights here today in our webinar. So again, welcome. Okay, so Laurie, you can share your screen. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert, for that great introduction. We appreciate GMRG's invitation and also Arizona State University. So as Robert mentioned, my name is Lori Sisk. I'm a lecturer at Wayne State University. So I'm going to go through the first part of this, which is the background and the preparedness. And as Robert mentioned, we'll also be going through the challenges, strategies, and the conclusions. So with the background, I just wanted to specify what is it that we did. We created a 15-question survey that took about 5 to 7 minutes. Some of you may have participated in that survey. And we were really looking at that preparedness, like we said, the challenges, the strategies, and the innovation, creativity that happened throughout this COVID that we have going on now, in the past and currently, obviously. So why did we do this? QAD, actually, leading ERP company, came to Wayne State University and asked to form the survey. We at Wayne State have a very strong supply chain program with over 550 students, and we also have a focus on complex manufacturing, and we do have an MS in automotive supply chain and have been rated in top 25 Gartner. So that is why QAD approached us to help with this survey. So thank you, QAD, for that. We very much appreciate it. How did we do this? We used our own networks, and we, through Wayne State, QAD, and AIG. As Robert mentioned, AIG is the Automotive Industry Action Group, and they enable collaboration within automotive and related industries to provide education and information to stakeholders so that everybody can continuously improve. So it's about continuous improvement, and AIG is very much known for their standards and their training in the automotive industry, which many of you may be a part of. When did we do the survey? We did it between June 10th and July 3rd this year. So it's pretty new still. And we got some very good results, which you will see in a moment here. Where did we do it? Well, it was originated from Detroit. We're sitting here in rainy Detroit today, but it didn't matter because you'll see that we were able to reach the globe. And who got that survey and responded? So interestingly enough, with the strong network that AIG has and some of our respondents as well, we had over 700 respondents from more than 20 countries, and that included those listed there. Also, to emphasize, we had a large majority of those respondents that had less than 200 million in revenue in 2019. What that told us that a large majority of the respondents, which may have been some of you, were from the tiers, tier 2 through tier N. And the largest industry represented was automotive, obviously with AIG's connection that really brought that forward for us. And also what we found very interesting is that most respondents were from the quality function. So that was who responded in this survey. And we got some really, really great results, which you'll be hearing throughout this process in this webinar. So one of the first pieces that we asked about was this preparedness in facilities. So actually in the plant environment, what were you prepared, not prepared at all, or fully prepared? You can see overwhelmingly that fully prepared was the majority of those respondents responded very favorably to. So what are some of the things that may have happened? Preventing the virus from entering your facility. I think that many organizations put together an app, if you will, ask questions before you come, take your temperature, those types of things to prevent the virus from coming into the facility. And reducing the risk of virus exposure and transmission. I know that several organizations and plants actually put plexiglass in between the workers. They required masks and also different, I would say, processes when you would walk into an organization, such as using your elbows to open doors or hit turnstiles or what have you. And then reacting, I think that there were a number of countermeasures put in place if the virus was detected in the facility. So I think that that was basically the fully preparedness that we received as far as within the plant facilities. One of the other questions that we asked was to rate the extent in which your organization used the following resources to detect the supply chain readiness to restart the operations. So as you can see here, there were some that really came to the top of that survey question. One of them is planning systems. So when we think about planning systems, we think about production planning. And that really covers a number of processes in many organizations, from inventory, supplier scheduling and delivery, production schedules, and obviously shortages on a daily basis. Very well aware that there were daily, if not multiple meetings daily to talk about these shortages and where different complications may come as far as making sure that the organizations are ready to restart those operations. The next item that came up was IATF/QMF. QMS, I'm sorry, for those of you that may not be familiar with IATF, it is IATF 16949, and it has replaced ISO and TS 16949. And that is the international standard for automotive quality management systems. So that basically has taken over from ISO. And I'll say Lang knows a lot more about these than I do. And also our QAD partner is one of the leading providers for training as well in this piece, and as well as in MMOG, which I'll get into in a minute. But what this IATF and QMS does is really provide continual improvement, defect prevention, and reduction of variation and waste, and take out that MUDA in supply chain. So the next item that came up fairly highly is supplier portals. This is really the main communication hub between the supply base and the manufacturer that is receiving those goods. So those, I'm sure, were very much in heavy use through this process and really enabled that communication, which was so key throughout this process. As I mentioned, MMOG LE. So MMOG LE stands for Materials Management Operations Guidelines Logistics Evaluation. And it is a self-assessment tool, and it's a global standard for supply chain management processes that provides the industry best practices. It is heavily utilized within the automotive world. And as I mentioned a minute earlier, QAD provides a lot of training in this system and works directly a lot with AIG on this. The focus areas in MMOG is strategy and improvement, work organization, capacity and production planning, customer interface, production and product control, and supplier interface. So it really covers the gamut of an organization, and it is required by some customers that companies do complete that self-assessment tool. And then we do have some other ones listed as business analytics, software, and consulting organizations. So with that, that concludes this section, and I'm going to pass it off to Robert and see if there's any initial questions, or should we move directly to Lang, or to Hakan, I'm sorry.
That's great. Thanks for this introduction. I think very, very interesting. I think we have time for one question. So let me start off with one. So Laurie, you talked about the preparedness within facilities. So why do you think that the majorities of the companies you've surveyed were actually fully prepared? Because that's what you were describing within their facilities.
Right. So I think that many organizations, many companies have a lot of risk management processes in place. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the companies are also very global. So they did have some heads up that this pandemic was coming our way, I'll say, in the United States at least. And every day these organizations and plants deal with issues and risks and having to put out fires, and natural disasters at their supplier locations, missed shipments, lack of quality parts. The list can go on and on. So they are very quick to put in measures in place due to all of the efforts that they have done throughout. And many of the people on this call can definitely attest to that. You know, if you're in manufacturing or quality supply chain purchasing, that those processes have come into place and have been able to be utilized throughout this pandemic.
Excellent. Thank you, Laurie. So I'm pretty sure there are more questions, but I would like to move on to Hakan Yildiz to the next part. And again, I would like to encourage everyone who's participating and attending here today. If you have a question, please share your question in the Q&A section of Zoom. We will organize your question, collect your questions, and then we will have some time in the Q&A part to answer some of your questions. So thank you. Okay, Hakan.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I would like to continue with the challenges faced by companies. So if you can go to the next slide, Laurie. So we asked our respondents what their most challenging activities were as they are restarting their operations. And as we can see in this chart, verifying and responding to immediate customer delivery requirements ranked at the top of the list as the most challenging activity. Verifying the status of suppliers restart came in third. So overall, if we combine these two responses together, I think we can say that supply chain coordination as a broad term was the most challenging activity for restarting operations. In addition, as the chart shows, internal issues ranging from workforce issues to managing COVID-19 in operations and recovering operational stability were also nearly as challenging for companies. Going to the next slide. So we also asked about specific disruptions that companies may have experienced during the pandemic. We specifically asked about demand shortage and demand surge, likewise supply shortage and supply surplus they might have had, and also labor shortage issues they might have experienced. And demand shortage seems to be the most prevalent disruption overall. About 51% of the respondents indicated that their organization has experienced it at some point during the pandemic. So this can be early in the pandemic or later, but at some point more than half, at least half of the companies have experienced some sort of demand shortage, demand drop. On the other side, some companies, although a relatively small percentage, but still significant, have actually experienced the opposite, a demand surge. About 20% of organizations have had a demand surge at some point during the pandemic. And as a side note, we can say that, not surprisingly, those in life sciences and healthcare have experienced demand surge significantly more than other industries. The second type of most prevalent disruption was supply shortage. So about 38 to 40% of organizations have experienced supply shortages at some point during the pandemic. And close to that comes the labor shortage. So about 34% of the respondents indicated that their organization had experienced a labor shortage at some point during the pandemic. Going to the next slide. We also wanted to know when the company started to prepare for supply and demand disruptions. We gave them a time frame month by month, starting from November until April 2020. And as you can see, both graphs are pretty similar. Both charts are pretty similar for supply and demand. And most organizations, specifically about 70%, started preparing for pandemic-related supply or demand disruptions by March 2020. So basically, most of them realized that this pandemic is going to hit them. So they started preparing by March. And this is irrespective of industry, company type, or company size. And preparations, again, seem to be mostly in sync between supply and demand disruption preparations, but we can say that slightly more percentage of companies started for supply disruptions earlier than disruptions for demand. We also asked our respondents what made them start preparing for supply disruptions specifically. And according to the feedback that we received, organizations that started preparing for supply disruptions early, and by early, we mean by January 2020, did so due to the pandemic's impact and shutdown in China and related information obtained from their global suppliers. Organizations that started preparing later, again, this is after April 2020, did so in response to more local developments, such as auto plant shutdowns, stay-at-home orders of their governments, and so on and so forth. In short, we can say that the degree to which an organization is globally connected may have made a distinction in the timing and the way they responded to supply disruptions. So we also wanted to know what made companies respond or start preparing for demand disruptions. And organizations seem to be mostly reactive rather than proactive in their response to demand disruption or surges, because most of them indicated that customer order changes prompted their preparations. Going to the next slide, we also wanted to get a feel of the timeline of the disruption. So, we wanted to know what type of patterns have emerged, what type of disruptions were experienced in what period of time by different companies. So we gave them 3 buckets. So early in the pandemic, which is November to February, and then March to May, and then June 2020 and onward. And we asked them to pick those 5 disruptions for each period if they have experienced them. And as we can see, most respondents indicated that they did not experience any demand or supply changes until March 2020. Between March and May, the most common disruption was demand shortage, which is that yellow tall bar that you can see in the middle. However, many organizations also experienced labor and supply shortages during that same period. And from June 2020 and onward, demand shortage became the clear dominant disruption type for that period. And also, interestingly, the labor shortage is the second highest challenge in that same period, basically after June 2020. With that, I would like to pass it on to Ting if there are no questions at this point, so that she can discuss the strategies and innovations that companies have utilized.
Okay. Great, Hakan. Very, very insightful. So thank you for sharing this. I think we have 1, maybe 2 minutes, maybe for one follow-up question. And again, if you have any additional questions, please share your questions in the Q&A field. Hakan, one question is, so you talked about different challenges, right, companies were facing. Did you see any differences between the responses from OEMs versus suppliers, right? So if you go from the manufacturer to the supplier, did you see there any differences in the responses?
Actually, yes, there was some significant difference. So for the larger companies, OEMs, verifying the supplier restart status was by far the most challenging activity, according to the feedback that we received. And in contrast, for the smaller companies and part or component manufacturers, basically the suppliers to the manufacturers, verifying and responding to customer delivery requirements was the most challenging activity. So this sort of dichotomy, right? So different sides of the coin reveals communication and coordination problem between organizations downstream and upstream within the automotive supply chain.
Very interesting. Okay, great. Thank you. I mean, that speaks to the supply chain impact and component of this entire pandemic. So very good. Okay, so I think we are ready to move on to the next part, strategies and innovation. So Dr. Ting Yang will continue now.
Okay, so thank you, Hakan and Lori, for giving us a good background of the survey and also the interview that we have been doing and we continue to do. And so by now, you should have some idea about this type of disruption, actually a very complex patterns of disruption that different company, different industry and sizes they have been experiencing. So now it's important to see what they have been doing, right? So in the survey, we collect information about company responses in two ways: what they actually did and what they hope they should be doing more. So it's sort of like a regret gap. And in addition to the responses, so you know, for some dark cloud, sometimes you have this silver lining, right? So whenever there's big disruption happening, that also means this is a good opportunity for a company to radically innovate because they have to do something new. They have to change what they used to be doing in order to survive and sometimes even to thrive out of this disruption. So we'll talk about the responses in two parts, actual versus should, and also we'll talk about some of the innovation that the survey identified. So going into the next slide. So we are able to see that the top 5 responses the company actually did listed here. The first one is they adapt their production plan to meet new demand or supply alterations. So you might feel like, is that what companies usually do? Yes, yes and no, right? So company, they usually will need to do this routinely because customer change demand and supplier might have some issue. So you might need to adjust your production schedules. But what we really mean here is they actually change the frequency and the intensity of this production plan changing. So instead of doing this monthly and with some minor changes, now they probably have to do this weekly and with the higher level of change. And then we have also heard from manufacturers in our follow-up interviews that companies are continuing to do this. So they have the weekly meeting to discuss how they can change their production plan to adapt to emerging disruption, either on the downstream side or on the upstream side. So this seems like to be a sustaining response that will go into the future. And the number 2 is very interesting and is actually a little bit to our surprise. Company talk a lot about utilizing safety stocks. Because for the automotive industry, they are very famous for the just-in-time, all starting with Toyota production system. So the supply chains are relatively lean, and then so the inventory is not that high as compared to some of the other industries. But companies from the earlier responses that you heard from Hakan and also Lori, most of the companies in our survey feel like they are very prepared for the disruption. And actually one reason is the timing of this pandemic. So if you know that the time when the pandemic first hit China is around the New Year time. So usually the automotive manufacturers and suppliers, they know during the New Year time, Chinese suppliers won't really produce. They will have 2 or 3 weeks of downtime. So they actually are prepared for that by having a higher level of buffer inventory on hand. So when the pandemic really hit the US and also like China and other part of the world, most of the company, they still have enough safety stock in their supply chain to help keep their production line moving forward. So we actually heard from one of the interviewees that they feel like they feel like lucky. they said if the pandemic hit China in another time, the consequence might be even more worse. So that turned out to be the number 2 response the company had, using their buffer inventory. And then what follows, the next 2 is to using pre-qualified suppliers. That's intuitive. If one supplier is down, let me quickly switch to another supplier. The next one would be switching between different transportation modes. So if air that does not work, let's move to water or to railroad. So companies are relying on the flexibility of their logistic infrastructure to move things around. The last one is really the most unique one out of this top 5 responses. Because the first 4 is more reactive in nature, is they all happen after the disruption hit the supply chain. While the last one, which is implementing analytical tools to assess what if scenario. So this one has a little bit proactive nature in it, because it shows that the company understand the power of data and information, the big analytics, to make sense of the information that you have, and to predict the future. So we actually are very exciting that this one entered into the top 5, because it shows that company realize the importance of understanding and also predicting future. So going on into the next one, we're gonna look at what they regret in terms of what they feel like they should do more, which is the blue bar, but they don't do much, which is the orange bar. So the key thing for those 5 items is the gap between the blue bar and the orange bar. So since we just finished the what if analysis part, so you see the first item that they feel like they should do more, but they don't do that much, is to implement advanced technology tool for planning demand. So now they understand that the demand could be seriously disrupted during the pandemic like this. And also increase investment in risk management tools, number 2, and mapping out the supply base, knowing where your sub-tier suppliers are, knowing that something might hit them, and how to assess the consequence, the scale of influence on yourself, right? And the next one is some companies are thinking they should considering the location, their supply base. Should they reshore or nearshore? Because the closer you are, the better visibility. So it's connected with the third one. And lastly, we already heard from Hakan that there are a lot of labor shortage, disruption starting in March and also continuing in June. So more manufacturing automation probably is one solution to reduce your supply, your production system and your supply chain's reliance on labor. Going into the next slide, we're gonna see what company have been creating, right? So the previous part is more in terms of how to survive from the pandemics. But companies are really smart. So although they have a lot of their supply chain production system are disrupted, but they actually turn out to have a lot of extra capacity to do something new, right? If my production plan cannot run, what else can we do? So we actually heard from companies that there are innovations emerging out of this disruption. So in general, we can see 3 categories. Product, what do they produce? So you probably have heard that Ford and GM are making the respirators, and FCA are making masks. So the PPE products are something that automotive companies can quickly produce, which is amazing. And also they are also adapting their existing products. So whatever they are producing, say cars, right? So they can quickly adapt the final design of the product according to what they have on hand. So that's minor adaptation of the existing product. Since you have new product, now you probably have new customers, right? So for respirators and the mask, probably the customer are their own employees or maybe their suppliers. And then when you have new design, new product designs, then you can have new markets. So you will have new customers. Of course, you will have new suppliers. So that's a second part of innovation, is around who do I partner with, or who do I send my product to, or who do I source my component from. And finally is how do you make them, right? So the manufacturing process is, there are a lot of innovation that we heard from companies. So they're doing things to automate the manufacturing process, to be less labor intensive, to keep the social distancing, but while still keep the production line running. And also cross-training workforce, because during the pandemic shutdown, many facilities, they cannot open. So they actually have extra labor and machinery and also space capacity idle. So they actually are creating a lot of new training programs to cross-train the workforce, just to prepare them so they can have better labor-wise flexibility in terms of moving people around. So if one person cannot come to work, I have another backup person on hand to get the task done. And finally is automation. So there are a lot of manufacturing process innovation coming out of the pandemic, so making the whole process less labor intensive. So overall, it's really a system level of innovation that is emerging, which is encouraging from us, like to see that companies not only they are surviving, but they are thriving out of this disruption. So I'll stop here and then see if there's any question.
Yes, Ting Ting. Thank you so much. Very, very insightful. Thank you for sharing your points. We have some questions, but I think it makes sense to move on with Lang first. Let's conclude the discussion, and I think it makes sense because Lang will talk about the outlook and conclusion, and I'll move the questions into the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And I want to thank all the participants. And today I want to discuss with you some of the findings that we've had. I'll start with the outlook. And with that, we had several respondents as far as C-suite exec and logistic professionals. These groups indicated that at a 79% clip and a 93% respectively, that they expect the revenues to return shortly. The information that you see in this chart is aggregated. Therefore, in order to find some of the detail, you'll have to dig into the survey itself. But as you can see, most believe that from 6 to 12 months, that this will feed into returning to the pre-COVID levels. Unfortunately, as we've all experienced, this pandemic has been extended a little bit, and this was basically, Robert, I'm receiving some feedback. Is there a way to adjust that?
You hear, no, I don't know. I'm sorry. Can
Okay.
you, yeah.
I'll work with it.
Okay, I'm sorry for the technical issues.
Anyway, so with this, I want to caution all participants, as this information was a moment in time, but I think that it's just going to slide by how this is being exacerbated from the recovery that's going on currently. And that's primarily restricted to the US. Other countries are they're experiencing something different. Okay, can we go to the next slide? Okay, risk. This is a very interesting subject. And as you can as you have heard from previous presenters, companies were kind of prepared for this. They identified this was very pervasive. Robert, I'm going to switch over a little bit. This is disruptive to me.
Okay.
I'm almost there.
Okay, no problem. Okay, again, as a reminder for everyone, if you have any additional questions for our panelists, please share them in the Q&A field. In a few minutes, we actually move to our Q&A part, and then we'll have time to actually go into a more open discussion. So please share your questions in the Q&A field. Also, again, if you have any other questions, feel free to also look into our LinkedIn website if you want to learn more about GMRG and other information. Okay, Lang, is it working now? Yeah. Why don't we?
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Okay, I hear an echo. I'm not sure if the others also hear an echo. Try it again, Lang.
Okay, I'm going to risk.
Yeah.
How about now?
Lang, there is an echo. What you could do is maybe switch off or just take it away from your docking station, please. Your phone. That will reduce the disturbance.
Okay, I'm leaving the phone.
Okay. Lang, I will mute you just for a second so that you can turn off maybe one device. And how about
Okay, can you hear me now?
Okay, I think we have it now.
It's
Yeah,
good.
I think it's better. Okay, great. Lang, I think you can continue.
Lang, you're on mute. Okay, Lang, I'm going to call you. Professor Robert, if you can just take over from here for a couple of minutes.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know if the team wants to finish the presentation. Otherwise, I have one question maybe from Ting Ting from the previous part. Whatever you prefer. Yeah, Ting Ting. Okay. So maybe let's move one step back. And you talked about the strategies and innovation. So I have here 1, 2 questions. So, and actually 2 questions that are very similar. So the top 5 responses you've presented, to what extent are those industry specific? In other words, do you think these responses can be also found in other industries, so means non-automotive related? And that is also related to one question here, where someone asked about the electronic segment. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So that's a very good question. And we actually have done some preliminary analysis just to try to split up the sample into automotive, and because we have several big major categories of industry, automotive and non-auto, complex manufacturing, healthcare, and then we have consumer goods, we have industrial and other. We don't really have the electronics as a specific industry category, so cannot say specifically for electronics. But we have tried some preliminary analysis to see if the pattern changed significantly across industry categories. To our surprise, it does not show very big difference across the industry groups. So it's a quite universal, like a ranking in terms of the top responses to the pandemic. But one thing that we do realize, like that's from the follow-up interview, in terms of this using pre-qualified backup supplier and then switching the transportation modes, that seems like to be a little bit probably automotive specific, because in the auto industry, usually they will have the dual sourcing, and then the products, they have this common automotive, like a car platform, and then common components are like extensively used. So that sourcing, like product structure, does allow them to move from one supplier to the other one, maybe in another continent or country quickly. So if that's not the like specific product architecture or sourcing structure you have in your industry, then probably you don't have that flexibility in terms of moving around.
Muted. Okay, thank you, Ting Ting. Very insightful. Good. So I will ask Leng one more time. Can
Yes.
we hear you now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you for fixing this issue. Great. So I think then let's take 5 more minutes to complete your part so that we can then move into the Q&A part. Thanks for your patience, Leng.
Sorry about that to all the participants out there today. Just a technical difficulty that we run into sometimes. I'm sure you've encountered something similar in your new world that we've all experienced lately. As I was starting to say, and part of the conclusions here, risk is identified as by senior management as being a very pervasive concern of theirs in their facilities and restarting the operations, as you heard earlier from Ting Ting. The proactive actions that they've taken, though, are enlisting the assistance of third parties in order to provide them with these warning systems that they utilize in order to predict a little bit better what is coming at them. So they're using predictive analytics in a way. Unfortunately, as you saw in the chart before, it is not as pervasive as you may want it to be. So that's one of those areas of concern that maybe you can take a look at within your own respective organizations in order to build upon that. Others, we have natural disasters that have occurred, which kind of gives us a little bit of a forewarning. But if you have a Fukushima in Japan, that's going to affect the globe quickly because a lot of the supply chain is extended, and all of a sudden within a month or two, you're going to have some shortages, and you'll have to figure, do I have a second or an alternative source of supply that I can quickly switch over to? Thirdly, and this is one that's unseen and we don't talk enough about it, is the risk of cyber. Companies have been attacked. Some of you that are on this webinar today have been attacked. You know of it. Not a lot of information is shared amongst each other, which is an Achilles heel, quite honestly, because if you would share that information, you're better able to deal with where it's coming from. And you may even be able to predict your next attack. Risk management tools, supply chain mapping and so forth, and developing what is that what if scenario that I need to address. Now, a lot of you have those planning tools and early warning systems in place, but next slide, please. Okay, with this, they've taken some innovative approaches and created new product lines. We've identified and developed new customers, and this is in order to keep the doors open respectively in our organizations. Utilize best practices to adapt new business realities. Companies utilize known industry standards with adaptive modifications such as IATF 16949, core tools, disciplines, and so forth. The IATF stands for International Automotive Task Force, which replaced the quality because the ISO 9000 did not want to be more specific to automotive, but automotive had a higher requirement. Therefore, they created the IATF task force, and they put that on top of ISO. So ISO did not go away. It's just that they amended it with the IATF 16949 standards. Along with that, companies, they took a look at the government because that's where they get a lot of their playbooks from in order to develop their contingency plans. They also, as you can see, that very last bullet point, peer companies. Now, when you come to these conferences and things like that, you have a little time to network, and that offers opportunities to share some common issues without working with your intellectual properties in exchange for information. This has been a success for a lot of people. The government playbooks, though, is the one they rely upon the most. Next slide, please. Okay, in closing, as you had heard already, a lot of companies considered that they were in a good position. With the pandemic, we had an early warning system coming at us, like Ting Ting had indicated earlier. Companies have started to hear about it in January. And as we moved into January through March, it really became prevalent that this is not going to go away quickly. And the depth of the medium-sized and smaller companies is the highest risk. Manufacturers and upper tiers, they assist their lower tier suppliers. And remember, your supply chain is only as good as the weakest link. And therefore, you have to focus in those areas in order to remain solvent and have a tomorrow in your world. Now, some of the things that were beneficiary with this, when we look at these situations, there are two sides to the coin. There is the adversity that we work with, but there's also an opportunity as well. And as you all have seen now, the companies like Walmart, Amazon, we are on a Zoom meeting. Most people didn't even know Zoom existed prior to what's going on today. And here we are. And the new PPE providers, Ford and GM, as you heard earlier from Ting Ting. So this has brought about a new dynamic that we're going to be embracing going forward. We're not going back to the old way of doing business. There was the bad, let's face that, but there's also the good, because a lot of you out there are professionals and you've reacted to this pandemic in a way that brought out the best in you. So with that, next slide, please. I think these are some of the people that were a little bit underrated here, and we need to thank our emergency workers as we continue to go forward with this, working with the pandemic and creating new things. I want to thank you, the participants, and I want to advise you that the survey for this particular webinar, it is already out on the AIAG website. You can go to this link here if you should have the copy of the program here, but if you do not, I was just advised that the link to go into this particular link inside of our website is on our homepage at aiag.org. And I want to thank you all for joining us today, and should you have the questions, Robin and Swati, they will field them for us, and we're here to serve you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lang, and everyone for these insights. Lang, also thanks for your agility to manage your technical disruption here. So I think we managed it well in the end. Also, maybe there's a way to share this link you just show here on the screen in our chat, so that every attendee can directly copy and paste the link into the browser. I think that would be very helpful. Maybe we can make that happen. And yes, so we have a couple of questions. Now we have approximately 10 minutes for the discussion, so a little bit less time, but let's try to go through some of the questions. I want to go back to the idea of how the future of manufacturing, and we discussed it already. Morris Brown asked a question early on, and she compared kind of the automotive industry to the healthcare industry, and the healthcare industry was very agile, was able to quickly pivot and manufacture PPE, personal protective equipment, for the healthcare industry. Now, also we heard about the automotive industry. There was a good level of preparedness to some extent, but what do you think? How will the future of manufacturing, and I believe we talk here about the automotive industry, will change in the future? What do you think? I think that is a more open question to everyone.
I'll just start out. In talking to some of the folks in automotive at the OEM supply base level, they're kind of were interested to find out the complexity that it took to build PPE. They're used to lots and lots of parts, very specific requirements, as you've heard, but it was also very difficult also to manufacture PPE. So I think the correlation and the understanding and the appreciation of being able to produce those other commodities and categories that they're not used to producing brought to light a lot of innovations, as Ting Ting had mentioned. So I think that now they know they can do it. And you might see a lot of these companies expanding their commodity and category base down the road now that they're functioning, they're producing. And so I think that it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how, these typical automotive companies are now branching out into other areas which they hadn't before. So, that's based on some conversations with some of the OEMs and supply base. I don't know, Ting Ting or Hakan or Lang, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I highly agree with it. Yeah, for many years, I think for manufacturing, like supply chain professionals who work in the automotive industry, it's really a high pressure, very demanding job, like working in the automotive industry as a supply chain professional. Because here, risk is very high, and then every day you deal with disruption. And then so if you think about that from a company perspective, they are already, like the automotive manufacturers, no matter OEM or suppliers, they're already well trained in terms of handling disruption and then like managing their supply chain really lean, while at the same time deliver satisfied customers. So now, because of this pandemic, it's really like a high pressure cooker. Like it just forced them to like change in a positive way in terms of realizing, wow, we can do this. So I think it's an opportunity for the automotive industry looking forward in terms of thinking about what they can produce. Maybe it's not just car, right? So a lot of new business model innovations are coming out. So I think that's the positive side.
And I think that some of them had a lot of sense of pride. Back in the previous wars, the automotive companies pitched in to switch over products and produce airplanes and other materials and so forth. And so this generation that we have today felt the same type of pride within their particular automotive companies as well. And a lot of the engineers in these companies, I've spoken to several of them, they come from other areas of business, such as aviation and of medical as well. So they had some experience in working with this, and they were able to contribute a lot to this. So I'm not surprised by the reaction. I'm glad that they're on our side in order to do the best that we can, given the circumstances that we're working in.
One last thing that I would like to add, Robert, is that I will depict a little bit of a grim picture on top of that optimism. One thing that we need to realize that is automotive industry is suffering a huge demand shock, right? So it is like demand this drop is amazing. So there is huge overall in the number of sales a drop across the board. So this additional line of business is actually can be a lifeline for that extra capacity that the automotive industry may end up with. It is given that the industry is now able to produce that next different type of products, the PPEs, and this basically is something that will be needed in the foreseeable future in large quantities. I think it may be here to stay for them to produce them.
Excellent, great, thank you, great insights. I guess a question from one of our attendees that was rather general. Are there any templates you would recommend for a restart process? Now, Laurie, you talked about MMOG, Materials Management and Operations Guideline, as part of a self-assessment. Is that maybe an answer to this question? Can you, can we derive from these guidelines any templates that can be used for restart processes?
Yeah, and I'll let Lang answer a majority of this, but MMOG definitely a self-assessment tool. There's also a readiness checklist that is on the AIG landing page that QAD and Quistem had created. Lang, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I think to directly answer that question, you mentioned the key point. There's a readiness checklist that we have on our webpage. MMOGLE is preventative. It's addressing all the things that you should be doing. And if you did not have a readiness plan, which is one of the questions in the MMOGLE tool, portal that is, it's a web-based, cloud-based tool, it will address it to you long before these type of things occur. It is a model that teaches and provides information as to what a company should be doing in order to survive in these industries, and is predictive in many of ways, and that it avoids the situation. So managing your materials in your operation.
Yeah, and just again, Robert, there is a readiness checklist that was created that you can go to at the AIG website, and I think that will really help some folks look at, what do they need to get ready. It's pretty comprehensive, and thanks to QAD and Quistem for creating that.
Excellent.
If I may add, Robert,
sure. Go ahead.
With the pandemic, we've put quite a few tools out there for free that AIAJ normally charges for, or is free to its members. But until the end of the year, it's free to the general public. So if you click on AIG.org, you'll see a host of buttons there to click on, a suite of information pieces that the industry can utilize. Please feel free to take advantage of that. Also, there's a button on the homepage for the survey itself. So if you can't remember the link that's in front of you right now, you can utilize the button to go in and pick up the PDF copy of the survey.
Excellent. Great. Thank you. Then I would like to go back to Ting Ting. And you talked about the should versus actual gap of the top 5 responses you presented. And you also, I believe, talked about something reshoring, nearshoring. And here we have one related question from Claire Wang. How realistic is it for the auto industry to reshore away from China? I think that goes directly addresses this should versus what is happening gap.
Yes, so that's a great question. And we as particularly me, Hakan and Laurie, we actually asked that same question during our follow-up interviews to companies, is consider this. And then we actually also interviewed supply chain professionals in the auto industry in China. So we asked them what their view. So definitely this local sourcing is coming up a lot from our interviews. So company realizes they want the supplier to be close to them. But in terms of moving the supply chain, particularly the automotive supply chain out of China, that seems like to be a long step, at least from what we heard, because it takes time to build up a reliable supply chain, particularly for complex manufacturing. So my personal view is that won't happen immediately, but could it happen? Maybe. So we hear so what we hear and what we believe is that this is a long shot. It's not going to happen overnight. And also, if you are reading a news, so I was reading this morning's news. The auto the sales in China was rising at the highest speed in 2 years, right? So if you think about the China as an automotive market, the fastest growing market, probably you don't want to move out of China that quickly.
Excellent.
To that point,
thank you, Ting Ting.
To that point, China is the largest automotive market in the world. America is around 17 million a year annually, whereas China is probably 26 to 27 million units annually. So that's substantial quantity higher, and therefore there'll be more part suppliers, catering to that. So I agree with that.
Very good. And related to this point, probably Lang and Ting Ting, you can respond to that. This was one of the questions from the audience, and basically related to the ongoing U.S.-China political tension that is still going on. Was that also something that still was on the mind of respondents even during the pandemic, or was it rather not so much mentioned? Did you hear anything from the respondents?
Can you say the question again? I didn't quite what
Okay.
is the question?
So here we have a question that, you mentioned the growing Chinese market and the growing role of China. Nevertheless, there are still political issues in the US-Chinese relationship. I mean, is that still an issue even during COVID-19, during the COVID-19 pandemic? Did you hear anything from your respondents in that regard?
We didn't specifically ask about political tension during the survey, but if you just think about the timing of the pandemic, that's actually right. I think at the time when the tension is really at the peak. So I think it's like the two are happening at the same time, and then it's sustained to the future. So you can see the political side continually have the tension, and then the pandemic is not going away. So I think both are creating a lot of challenges for a company operating in both countries.
What Ting Ting says is very true. From a different point of view, Father Time has taught me a few other things as well, and that is more effectively is when you have changes in trade agreements. That's when you're going to see dynamic changes occur. Otherwise, it's going to be something that is going to be a timely, slow changeover to whatever it may end up being. But like with USMCA, that's something that's dynamic. It's going to happen real fast. We are having a lot of people coming in asking, how am I affected? Lawyers on the Beltway are really happy at this moment because they're changing from NAFTA over to USMCA. And there's a lot of legal guides that need to be followed along with that. So same thing, no matter where you go on planet Earth. So that's how I would approach it.
Good. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, then I have one more question, and I believe that relates to Hakan's part that who talked about the challenges faced by companies. Hakan, you mentioned this interesting, you explained the interesting observation of labor shortages. So that labor shortages seem to be an ongoing challenge that has been experienced by companies even after June 2020. So do you have any insights, any explanation why that problem still persists?
I think this may be attributed to workers being concerned with returning to the workplace for health reasons, right? That might be one reason, and that's what we also heard from our interviews. And another interesting thing that we heard is the extended unemployment benefits. So many workers receive substantial amounts of income through those benefits that their governments provide, and combined with the concern to returning to workplace and this additional income might explain why some or many of the workers are not going back to work as quickly as needed, and that might basically explain this.
Very good. Okay, good. I would like to close with one last question, and that relates also to innovation. That's one last question here about information sharing tools. Did you learn any about what type of information sharing tools were most effective for the communication between automotive OEMs and tier one suppliers during the pandemic? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Lori, did you want to take it or you want me to take it?
So I think, you know, one of the things we definitely saw was the use of those production planning systems and also the use of supplier portals and being able to just have that open communication. Lang, do you have other comments you wanted to add?
Yeah, the preparedness list, again, on our website, I'm not trying to tout our website, but we put a lot of these tools right out there. And if you were to go onto our website, there's a blue banner that says hit the ground running with critical tools free through the end of 2020. And it says view the resources. And once you click on there, you'll see a host of products that can assist with any type of preparedness or readiness or any planning that you would need in order to get up and running again. There are continuity plans that we brushed off and updated in order to prepare industry for this. So these tools are readily available. Feel free to go out there. Should you have questions, feel free to contact me as well. I see there was one, Silva, that asked that particular question. So you can click on that panel and you can find all of the products that we were referring to earlier.
Perfect. So, and I believe what we will do is we will not only share this recording of this webinar, but also share your contact information and any additional resources that are linked to this webinar. So with this, I would like to close our webinar for today. We have more questions. We will get back to you by email, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So great participation, great insights. And I, again, want to thank everyone for taking the time, for asking great questions, and of course a special team to the Wayne State crew, as well as to Lang from AIG for sharing the insights. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure for these insights, and I hope we will continue this tradition of webinars as part of a GMRG series. So with this, I would like to just go back to our give me 1 second here, please. Yeah, so, and I hope you can see my screen. I want to go back to the initial question. So if you are interested in GMRG, please follow us on LinkedIn. Also, if you have any recommendation for future topics, please go on menti.com, use code 2452628 and share your ideas on menti.com. So that will help us actually to design some future webinars. So with this, okay, I would like to thank again everyone for participating. Special thanks to Hakan, Ting Ting, Lori, and Lang for sharing the insights today. Also special thanks to the entire ASU team that made this happen because it took some time to prepare, and I think that was greatly done. Special thanks to Professor Carl and OK and Swati, who is here. You heard her in the background, who was managing the process and the questions. So Swati, special thanks as well as to Dwayne from the IT team. And of course, special thanks to AIG, QAD, Wayne State, and the entire GMRG. Continue to follow us. And if you have any additional questions, send us an email. I will keep this slide a little bit longer on. So thank you very much. We will stop the recording soon. Thank you very much.